You're welcome. Are we ready? Everybody, if you could, silence or turn off your cell phones. And with that, we'll start. Good evening, and welcome to this very important and timely panel discussion. My name is Lynn Pasekis. I'm the chair of the Antisemitism and Bigotry Task Force of the Jewish Community Relations Council, or JCRC. As the public affairs arm of the Jewish Federation of Palm Beach County, JCRC is involved in many areas. We advocate for Israel. We connect with legislators and participate in government affairs matters. We develop relationships with other ethnic and faith groups. And we fight anti-Semitism and bigotry. Sometimes these issues delve into the political arena, but JCRC and the Federation are nonpartisan and non-political. Anti-Semitism, however, is on the rise on both the left and on the right. It is our duty to educate, identify, and speak out against it, no matter the source. Before we get into tonight's discussion, I want to draw your attention to your program sheet, where you'll find a list of our wonderful sponsors for this event. I must make special mention of Heidi Schaefer, MD Charitable Trust and the One World Davis Family Tolerance Project. Through your generosity to Federation's annual campaign, we are able to provide important conversations such as tonight's, at no charge. If you have already made your gift to the annual campaign, thank you. If you haven't yet contributed, now is the perfect opportunity. If you have any questions about the Federation, please speak to Joel Yodenfreund. I knew I was going to mess that up. Annual campaign chair. Could you please stand, Joel? Thank you. And if you'd like to discuss becoming more involved with the JCRC, please speak with Josephine Gahn. Joe, please stand. She's the vice president, or with me or any of the staff here tonight. I now hand the stage over to our moderator, Brett Sandala.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you all for coming today to participate in this important discussion. It has been widely reported that there has been a dramatic increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the United States and Europe over the past few years. Recent statistics bear this out. The FBI reported that in 2017 there was a 37% spike in crimes targeting Jews and Jewish institutions. In fact, attacks on Jews accounted for 60% of all religion-based hate crimes, the highest of any targeted religious group. There also has been a 45% spike in anti-Semitic activities on college and university campuses. And across Europe, 38% of Jews are considering leaving, according to a European Union survey, which also showed that 89% of European Jews believe anti-Semitism has worsened in the last 5 years, and that 85% believe anti-Semitism is the main problem in their country. With a historical shiver, we recently have read or seen schools, synagogues, and cemeteries defaced with swastikas. A few months ago, as a community, we experienced the virulent and deadly anti-Semitism of a gunman killing 11 people at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. The chant of "Jews will not replace us" from Charlottesville still reverberates in our heads. Open anti-Semitism seems to be back as if it ever went away. But the resurgence of anti-Semitism is unfortunately not just on the extreme right. There's also a growing anti-Semitism on the left that often takes a more subtle form. It, too, should be of concern to Jews in America. Lately, this form of anti-Semitism has bubbled to the surface in the Women's March and in statements by Congresswoman Omar and others employing such Jewish tropes as dual loyalty. History has taught us that we can't close our eyes or ears to anti-Semitism from whatever source it comes. We must pay attention to it, we must try to understand it, and we must speak out against it. Today, we've assembled an excellent panel to help us do just that. The biographies of the panelists are in your program, and shortly they'll have the opportunity to talk about themselves and their organizations in a little more depth. But let me just tell you how happy we are to have them here today and to bring their experiences and thoughts to our discussions. We have with us on your right Amanda Berman, founder and executive director of the Zioness Movement. We have We'll do them at the end. Everyone can clap. Dr. Janet Freedman, who is resident scholar at the Brandeis University Women's Studies Center. Quentin Hill, National Outreach Director of A Wider Bridge, a pro-Israel LGBTQ organization. And Sarah Levin, Executive Director of Jews Indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa, also known as JIMENA. Let's give them a welcome. We have specific questions for each of the panelists, and we have asked them to keep their answers to each question about 8 minutes long. When we have finished a couple of rounds of questions and exchanges among the panelists, we will have a Q&A from the audience, so please hold your questions until that point. We'll begin with round one with Amanda. Amanda, can you tell us a little bit about Zioness, what it is, and why you started the organization? And in your response, it would be very helpful if you could elaborate on the debate over whether one can be both a progressive and Zionist, or whether these beliefs are contradictory. Also, we would love to hear your reaction to the Women's March and the way it has evolved.
Hi. Yeah, I wish to turn them all on. So the question actually answers, the second question answers the first question. The second question was, can you be a progressive and a Zionist? And I think we all agree on the answer, but let's all say together, yes, absolutely. Not only can you be, but there is an inherent relationship between progressivism and Zionism. For the vast majority of American Jews, we are Zionists in large part because we are progressives. We are progressives in large part because we are Zionists. We are committed to the self-determination and liberation of all people, and of course that includes our own community. People don't understand what Zionism is. People think that Zionism is what it has been co-opted to be about, which is apartheid and genocide and occupation and colonialism. We all, I think, in this room know that that is simply a lie. People have stolen terms that describe our identity and turned them into weapons. And there hasn't been an organization, at least one that I was aware of as an activist, both within progressive spaces and within the Jewish community, where I felt like I could proudly stand as a progressive and a Zionist, and I could have the conversation that we just had, quick and simple, about how powerful it is for me to be both of those things and to stand proudly as both of those things. And because there was a void in the community, people were either people in our community, American Jews, who have been on the forefront of the social justice movements and spaces that we see pushing forward civil rights, racial justice, women's equality for so many different communities over the last several decades. But in this most recent kind of political moment, we have been showing up and been afraid to stand as a Zionist. And that's because Zionism is targeted in these spaces. And so we've been forced to check the Zionist identity at the door if we want to participate, if we want to participate comfortably at least. At the same time, we're forced to face a litmus test even when we show up as Jews and not Zionists. I can't tell you how many times I've shown up in a space and people see that I'm a Jew, or it comes up in a conversation and they say, what do you think about settlement policy? Has anyone else had this experience? Yes. It happens so often, and every time I say it, it resonates with people because they realize that it's happened to them too. No one shows up at the Women's March. No Chinese American woman shows up at the Women's March and is held accountable for China's occupation of Tibet. No one is asked, no Chinese American woman is asked what she thinks about China's imprisonment of 1 million Muslims. No individual is held accountable for the ostensible politics and policies of a foreign government in American progressive spaces except for Jews. And we've allowed people to put us in these boxes. We have participated in the litmus test game because we are a very compassionate community, because we want to see the movement succeed, and we don't want to stay home. But for people who have been showing up and have been subjected to the tests and, and the false choice between being a progressive and a Zionist have been staying home. A lot of people have said to me for a long time, how can you show up at the Women's March? How can you show up in, the racial justice march or, Black Lives Matter when there's so much anti-Semitism there? And it took me a while to realize that standing up and being in the space is actually the most important thing we can do. But once I realized it, I launched Zioness to provide a community to all of the people that want to be active in the space, don't want to check their identities at the door, and also understand how powerful it is to show up and to have the conversation with people who either have heard these horrible things about Zionism or have heard absolutely nothing about Zionism. So when you're in the space and you're standing proudly as a Zioness and you're talking about Zionism as a progressive value, a progressive movement, a movement for liberation and self-determination, it immediately flips a perception that people have, sometimes subconsciously. People don't always know what they think about Zionism, but somewhere in their head they might think it's something bad. And when they see you there as an ally for the movements they care about, for the issues they care about, and the communities they care about, next time they hear something bad about Zionism, they're going to say, no, but I met a Zionist once. And it's, even if that is subconscious too, it really has overall, if we're all out there in the spaces that we care about and we're rejecting the litmus test and we're standing proudly in our identities, instead of being ashamed of being a Zionist, we stand proudly, we show up and we explain, it's empowering. It is effective. We can save the movements that are being destroyed by the anti-Semitism because all of these committed activists are staying home. And if we are attacked in the spaces, which sometimes does happen, it actually calls attention to the problem that unfortunately a lot of people don't even know exists. So when you're calling attention to the problem and you're showing up in a way that can actually help solve the problem, you end up creating a void, a power vacuum that can be filled by people who actually stand committed to the advancement of all communities, including the Jewish community. So that's why I launched Zioness, and that's why it's been so effective. It's really resonating with people, especially young people who really don't know how to handle the situation that they find themselves in the progressive social justice movements that they care about. And all of a sudden, you know, we launched, and now we have 26 chapters all over the country. We have this incredible board of directors, and we have all of these people calling me, emailing me, Facebook messaging me every single day saying, how do I start a chapter? How do I get involved? This is a place for me, and I've been feeling so politically homeless this whole time. And so we're building that community, and with the creation of the community, there's power for us. There's an ability for us to speak with a unified voice and to speak over those very loud but very marginal voices of people who claim that anti-Zionism is a future of the American Jewish community. It simply is not true. But no one has unified the voice of everybody else. And that's what we're doing, and we hope you'll join us.
Thank you, Amanda. The next question is for Janet. The topic for today contains words that many see as academic jargon, such as intersectionality and white privilege, yet these terms have become central to politics on the left in modern days. Much of the social justice work that many Jews are committed to seems to be based on an intersectional approach. Can you help us to understand what these terms mean, and are they being taken out of context to promote anti-Semitism?
Wow, have I been given a hard assignment. I will do my best. I wrote down some things so I wouldn't go over my time. For some time, I've been studying and working with students on the relationship between language and activism, a project I've named The Words to Say It, the Ways to Do It. Some of my thoughts are reflected in a booklet on feminism and Zionism. There are some copies that Linda can raise her hand, has, and if you would like, can take one home. I prepared it for the Academic Engagement Network, an alliance of faculty across the United States working to oppose BDS and to preserve academic freedom. In that publication, I offered a definitional framework for the key terms in the feminism-Zionism debate. I wrote that I chose the word framework deliberately because language is always changing and definitions are fluid and contextual. Many words are invoked to signify membership in and solidarity with a group or a cause. In some instances, the speaker may not realize what they are committing to or judging in employing or in critiquing a term. That is the case with intersectionality and white privilege. I'll share my experience with the term white privilege first. In 1989, Peggy McIntosh published an article, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. In a few short pages, McIntosh revealed how white people can count on many unearned assets they never consider. She cited numerous examples, such as going shopping well assured they will not be followed or harassed, or being confident that their children will see representations of their race in curricular materials in their schools. For years, as a professor of women's studies, I used McIntosh's article in my courses, knowing that while many white students in the class easily understood male privilege, they may not have considered the unearned benefits of white skin. McIntosh turned the tables on looking at social structures in terms of the underprivileged, to show instead that some of us, in some ways, are overprivileged. After having read the article, throughout the semester, students would share instances of experiencing both male and white privilege in their own daily lives. We used exchanges within our class sessions to consider whether privileged behavior was occurring and what we could do to reverse it. As a member of the board of directors of the New Bedford Women's Center, the McIntosh article guided our practice. In that setting, too, we utilized specific examples and discussed how we could work together to take action, such as hiring staff whose experiences and identities reflected the people our agency served. 1989 was also the year legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw introduced the theory of intersectionality, the idea that when it comes to thinking about how inequalities persist, categories like gender, race, and class are best understood as overlapping and mutually defining rather than isolated and distinct. Intersectionality exposes the flaw in speaking of women, as if the word could describe all women. In failing to consider racial, ethnic, class, and other diverse factors, more powerful groups get to speak for and marginalize others. This awareness helps to see that the effort to fit all members of any group into a single descriptor is impossible and potentially destructive. Taken in this way, intersectionality is useful to those of us in this room, most of whom are Jewish, in considering how our experiences as Jews intersect with our skin color, class, gender, sexuality, age, geographical location, and other identities, and advantage and disadvantage members of our own group. But while I found it possible to act on the insights of Peg McIntosh's piece on white privilege, it is much harder to do work on the ground to implement intersectionality. Articles by academics and blogs by community activists argue that those who are on the receiving end of oppression are victims of systems of exploitation that also intersect and work together to keep power in the hands of the oppressors. White privilege continues to be named, but other terms are repeatedly invoked, as my colleague mentioned, including colonialism, neoliberalism, imperialism, and yes, Zionism. These are used without clear or sometimes any definitions, but signal membership in a progressive community doing social justice work. Although intersectionality corrects the idea that women cannot describe all women, the definition of Jew is not made more complex. Jews connote white and privileged, regardless of the reality of the diversity among them. Intersectionality claims to deplore hierarchies of oppression, but many of the articles I read demand that attention be paid to the most oppressed, according to those doing the defining. I have long seen myself as a progressive and a feminist and join others who are eager to de-center ourselves and support struggles for dignity and respect of all groups. But as I look back over my many years of activism, I am aware that in my frequent quoting of Hillel's famous adage, "If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? If not now, when?" I had de-emphasized the first question. On the feminist Jewish left, I had plenty of company. For one example, in Jewish Feminism and Intersectionality, the only monograph on the topic that I've discovered, Mala Brettschneider makes 2 points. She urges readers to address the dominance of Ashkenazi, that is, Jews of European descent, in their work as Jewish feminists, and that proponents of intersectionality include anti-Semitism in their work. One reviewer praises the work for its call to focus on Jewish racial issues, but dismisses the author's, quote, reiteration of the argument that Jewish concerns are ignored or discounted by other feminists, wishing that Brettschneider had instead argued, and I quote, that from a position of relative strength and security, particularly in the U.S. context, Ashkenazi Jewish feminists should use their resources to support the work of other, more vulnerable groups. This motif has pervaded the women's marches, the Dyke March, and much campus activism. It accounts for the failure of the National Women's Studies Association, an organization in which I have been active since 1977, to mention anti-Semitism in its initial statement condemning the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. Anti-Semitism, if addressed at all, is to be in the back seat of a narrative to be driven by other concerns. Yet, I do not think that intersectionality and white privilege promote anti-Semitism. If these terms were not in vogue, others would be used to marginalize and excoriate Jews. I have one short comment, and then I turn the mic over. How to respond? For my part, I stay in places where anti-Semitism is not at the fore, joining my colleague. I continue to work against racism, homophobia, Islamophobia, ageism, etc. When I experience anti-Semitism, I describe forthrightly what it is I see and hear. I use the word carefully and appropriately. I seek to have conversations that emphasize what I and others are for and how we can form coalitions based on positive values. More on this in my next turn.
Thank you very much, Janet.
Thank you.
That brings us to Quentin. A Wider Bridge, your group, promotes LGBTQ inclusion in Israel and relationships between the LGBTQ communities in the U.S. and Israel. Recently, at a national LGBTQ conference in Detroit, a group of activists holding Palestinian flags took the stage and led a 13-minute demonstration for Palestinian liberation and against Zionism. Many of us believed that Israel had a much better record than other Middle Eastern countries when it came to LGBTQ rights. Why the protest? Is this just part of a bigger strategy to delegitimize and demonize Israel in the progressive left? Are there other examples of that strategy that you would like to give us?
Sure. So I want to thank you all for being here and thank my fellow panelists. It's very rare that I'm the only male on a panel, and I am thrilled about it. So thank you so much. I'm going to start with a point of personal privilege for a second. I grew up in Iowa, and today is the 10-year anniversary of Iowa becoming the third state in the country to pass marriage equality. And I'm going to come back to why that's important in my other questions, but there's a lot that we can learn from the marriage equality movement and the issues that we're talking about tonight. So I wish I could say that what happened in Detroit was new. Sadly, it wasn't. We had been here before. A Wider Bridge is an organization that works with the LGBTQ community, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, queer community. We like our acronyms. We've been doing this work since 2010. And in 2015, there was a horrific attack that happened in the Jerusalem Pride March, where an ultra-Orthodox man ran into the parade, stabbed 6 people. This was actually not the first time he's done something like this in his life. He had done it in the 90s, went to jail, served his sentence, got out, and started planning the next attack. In that horrific attack, a 15-year-old girl named Shira Bonke lost her life. The organizers of the parade is an amazing LGBTQ center in the heart of Jerusalem called the Jerusalem Open House. And we as an organization were mortified by what had happened. We often talk about Israel's record on LGBT rights, and we'll get to that, about being so much better than its neighbors. But if that were true, how could attacks like this be happening in the capital of Israel? So in the aftermath of that, we decided to bring Jerusalem Open House to the United States to talk about what happened. How do you rebuild your community after such tragedy? And to, of course, raise resources for them in their time of need. Very similar to efforts that happened here in South Florida after the Pulse shooting. We decided to take them to this national LGBTQ conference called Creating Change. For those of us that are familiar with APAC, it's kind of like the APAC policy conference of the LGBTQ community, but instead of 18,000 Jews, it's 5,000 queers. I don't know which one's harder to deal with. But, and we held this reception, and about a week before the reception, we were told by the organizers of the conference that they were going to cancel our event because of security concerns. We realized it wasn't really about security, it was about the fact that we were bringing Israelis to an LGBTQ conference. The night of our reception, we finally got it reinstated after a week-long fight, and 300 protesters shut it down, screaming, "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." Kippahs were knocked off the heads of Jews. We were barricaded in a room, and the Chicago Police Department had to help our partners from Israel get out of that space. This is a community that was just traumatized by a horrific hate crime, and our own community is now putting them through more trauma. And that really shook us to the core as an organization, and realized that there was no organization in the broader LGBTQ community that was talking about Israel in a positive manner. That was Chicago 2016. Fast forward to Chicago 2017. Janet touched on this. There's a march in Chicago called the Dyke March. It's a self-proclaimed title, and it's a very alternative, radical space for queer women to have their own march separate of the Chicago Pride Parade. My former colleague, Lori Grauer, had been marching in this parade for 10 years. She showed up with her rainbow flag that had a blue Star of David on it. And the organizers of the parade came up to her and they said, "Are you a Zionist?" She said, "Yes, but I also support the right of self-determination for my Palestinian friends." They said, "That's not enough. Fold up your flag and go home. This is an explicitly anti-Zionist, pro-Palestinian march. You're not welcome here." This is happening in a community that prides itself on inclusion and tolerance. Diversity is the staple of the queer community. We are inherently an intersectional community. So fast forward to Detroit, it happened again. We still haven't been able to really sit down with the leadership of this conference to talk about, why does this keep happening? Why is this allowed in our community? I hope to have that conversation one day. But it's happening all over. There's another incident going on right now in San Francisco. We took this wonderful man named Manny, who runs a really great restaurant in the Mission that is a social justice space. It's open to the community. Anyone can come to his restaurant and hold an event there. And he's being boycotted weekly and has protests outside because he's a Zionist gentrifier. I saw an interesting sign that I just showed to Sarah before we started because I thought it was hilarious. It said, "Stop woke washing." All right. So we're seeing these things happen all the time. Woke, what is woke washing? So being woke means like you understand social justice. You're like on the front lines of these issues. And if you know a lot about these challenges that other communities are facing, you're woke. Well, apparently Manny's not woke enough. He's got to stop woke washing. So we'll get into other types of washing in a minute. I want to go back to Israel's record on LGBT rights, though. It is true. Israel does have an amazing record on LGBTQ rights. But if we're going to compare it to its neighbors, is that the bar that we want to set for our community? What happens to LGBTQ people in Iran? They're being hung from lampposts. ISIS is throwing them off buildings in Syria and Iraq. Brunei right now, or Brunei, is now going to stone people to death for this. Is that the level that we want to hold Israel's standard to on how great they are on LGBT rights? Let's get out of that framework. Let's applaud Israel and the LGBTQ Israelis who have fought and died for the rights that they have now, while also highlighting that there's so much more work to do. And the last thing I want to touch on is, this problem in the queer community. Is it really just another delegitimization effort of Israel? Yes, I think it is. I think that it's very easy to throw Israel and Zionism into these concepts that some of my fellow panelists have been talking about, that it's genocidal, it's an apartheid state, it's colonialist. We're in this era of buzzwords right now, where we can throw out a word, but we might not fully understand what that word means or what the context behind it is. And I think, unfortunately, Israel is being thrown into this framework. However, there are amazing organizations out there, like this great one I know called Wider Bridge, that is doing phenomenal work to try to correct this narrative. We realize that there's a problem in our community, and unfortunately, a majority of folks in the LGBTQ community are not inherently anti-Israel. They're not anti-Zionists. It's the 15% of people that are really loud and can get on a soapbox with a loud microphone and scream from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and think that they speak for all of us. They don't. And A Wider Bridge has adapted a new method to address this issue, where we're finding the top influencers in the LGBTQ community, elected officials, business leaders, academics, grassroots activists, and taking them on 10-day mission trips to Israel. There's no better way to teach someone about Israel than taking them and throwing them into the fold and letting them learn from themselves. And we're confident that the itinerary that we build for them at the end of these 10 days shows that, whoa, this issue isn't black and white. There's so much more nuance to this conversation that we're not hearing in our community. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I think that's a good place to stop.
Thank you, Quentin. Sarah, can you please tell us a bit about your organization, JIMENA, and if I'm pronouncing it correctly? Recently, JIMENA has written a scathing letter to Jewish Voice for Peace, condemning that group's attempt to create a revisionist history of the Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewish communities in order to promote a hostile, anti-Israel agenda. Please tell us about this as well, and give us your view of the damaging role that JVP plays on the progressive left.
Sure. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to the Thank you all for being here, and thank you to the organizers for having us. Before I start talking, I just want to get a sense of how many people in the room know the story of the 1 million Jewish refugees from North Africa and the Middle East who were expelled since the 1940s. How many people, if you can raise your hands? Thank you. And I'm wondering if there are people in the room who are actually from the Middle East and North Africa and who experienced this expulsion. Anyone brave enough? Wow. One person. Fascinating. Thank you. Okay, so JIMENA, just for a little bit of historical context, JIMENA was created to tell the story of the 1 million Jewish refugees from North Africa and the Middle East who were expelled since the 1940s because of anti-Semitic governments who claimed that they had to kick out the Jews, expel the Jews under the guise of anti-Zionism. They used Zionism as a means to legitimize and legalize the expulsion of close to 1 million people. We were created by former Jewish refugees from the Middle East and North Africa who wanted to tell the story to fight a revisionist narrative that's painting Israel as a white colonial outpost in the Middle East. Israel, right now, over half of its Jewish population descend from Arab countries. It's not like this room. It is a Middle Eastern country through and through. Here in the United States, people who are, the left now is taking this narrative that Israel is a colonial outpost, and they're using it to draw in progressives, to draw in young people who care about social justice and who know very, very, very little about the Middle East. So JIMENA was created by Jews from Arab countries to tell their personal stories. The foundation of our organization is built on a speakers bureau of people who wanted to go to college campuses, go to synagogues, and share their personal stories and raise awareness amongst American Jews about what happened to half of Israel's Jewish population and to them personally. There's two elements to what we do. JIMENA, first and foremost, is involved in advocacy. We are advancing legislation and policy that protects the rights and the property of former Jewish refugees from the Middle East and North Africa. We're working to protect movable and non-movable Jewish patrimony that's left in the Middle East, and that is sort of right now in danger of being sent back to the Middle East. We are working to brief policymakers and to educate legislators to make sure that they consider the losses of Jews from Arab countries when they're working on various pieces of legislation and agreements with Middle Eastern countries. The second part of what we do, which is probably even more important, is educating and engaging the various Jewish communities here in the United States on this story. So we live in a very Ashkenazi Jewish all of our communities are extremely Ashkenazi dominated for the most part. Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews are less than, we estimate, 20% of the American Jewish population. As I said, they're more than 50% of the population in Israel. Each year we lead about 100 immersive Sephardic events throughout the United States where speakers are sharing their personal story, and they're also engaging communities in the culture and the history of Sephardic Jews. We have various programs that are working hard to educate young Arabs, actually, in the Middle East and North Africa on this story. We have an Arabic outreach team that works in Arabic in countries throughout North Africa. We're working with individuals on the ground, and we're also sharing the story digitally. We're working as hard as we can with Jewish leadership to make sure that mainstream large Jewish organizations integrate and prioritize the stories of Jews from North Africa and the Middle East and the culture of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. Right now, young progressive Jews they're thirsty for diversity. They're thirsty for a Jewish experience and a Jewish modality that isn't built around, excuse me with all due respect, bagels and lox. They want something that's different, that they don't know about. So we are working very hard to try and get mainstream Jewish organizations to understand the history and to recognize how important it is to integrate the culture in their offerings and in their staff and in their institutions as a whole. So to get to the JVP letter, how many people are familiar with Jewish Voice for Peace here? Okay, so Jewish Voice for Peace is an anti-Zionist organization that is on the farthest fringes of Jewish life in the United States. They're based out of San Francisco, and they are promoting the BDS movement. So they're promoting the boycott, divestments, and sanctions from Israel. They are working closely with individuals who, are not our friends. They are doing everything they can to delegitimize Israel. Their activism is centered more on the delegitimization and the vilification of Israel than on the advancement of Palestinians. I don't see them as a progressive organization, and I don't think any of my co-panelists see them as a progressive organization. They're an extreme organization, and they are contributing to this wave of anti-Semitic rhetoric that we're seeing growing every day in progressive spaces. JVP recently, and I have to say, they're consenting to their own tokenization. They're really they're not a thoughtful organization. They're not serving their own mission. They're hostile. They're really just quite evil, in my opinion. They recently published a document called Our Approach to Zionism, which appropriates, revises, and explicitly lies about Mizrahi and Sephardic history and experiences in order to promote BDS. They are focused on one very sad chapter of Sephardic and Mizrahi history, and they are saying this is one of the many reasons why we need to boycott Israel. This booklet that they produced called Our Approach to Zionism is built on the erasure of Mizrahi and Sephardic voice, truth, and history. And it ultimately promotes an agenda which is harmful to Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews in Israel. It does not recognize that Zionism was a central part in the lives of Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews. It always has been, and it likely always will be. Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews are by and large proud Zionists in Israel and in the United States. It does not, their document and their quest for social justice and their quest for peace in the Middle East, they completely neglect the story of the state-sanctioned anti-Semitism in Arab countries that led to the expulsion of 1 million Jews that ultimately strengthened Israel. So together with a coalition of about 40 other Sephardic partners, we asked them to please remove all references to Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews from your organizational literature. I think we're really surprised. They don't have anyone, as far as we can tell, they're completely non-representative of a community, and they don't have any strong Sephardic and Mizrahi spokespeople who tried to sit down with us and work together and talk to us. The response was kind of ridiculous. They haven't actually responded to our actual request, which was to remove all references to our history from their organizational literature. Every single person on this panel can sit and talk about Jewish Voice for Peace and the damage that they're doing and how they are not helping progressive Jews. They're not helping progressive causes. They're not helping the Jewish people. They're not recognizing our intersectionality. They're not recognizing anti-Semitism. And they're not helping Palestinians. They're doing absolutely nothing to find a just solution to the conflict in the Middle East. So I'll end with that.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much, Sarah. Next question is back to Amanda. It has been argued that anti-Zionism is the latest form of anti-Semitism. Others counter that it is not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel's policies, such as settlement construction in the West Bank. Can you define Zionism and explain how anti-Zionism so often amounts to anti-Semitism by another name?
Sure. So the way that Zionists define Zionism, which is largely how I personally define Zionism, is the self-determination movement of the Jewish people in our historic ancestral home and our indigenous home. It is really nothing more than that. There, at the kind of turn of the 20th century, there was obviously political Zionism, Theodor Herzl Zionism, and that is what led to the reestablishment of a state, the State of Israel. But the politics and policies of the state are not actually a reflection of what Zionism is, which is a movement and a dream, a hope that has united the Jewish community for thousands of years in the diaspora, that we would one day return and reclaim our home and self-determine there and be sovereign, have a sovereign state and be able to protect ourselves. So the lines are blurry. It's not always so easy to define Zionism, but what I believe Zionism is a part of the Jewish identity. I don't believe that it is possible to divorce Zionism from what it means to be a Jew. That's not to say that the Jews who call themselves anti-Zionists can't make the argument, or that I'm denouncing their Judaism if they identify as Jews. In my opinion, they are Jews. But Zionism is part of who we are as a people. We pray toward Jerusalem. We say next year in Jerusalem on the holidays. We are supposed to say, if we're religious, which I'm not, but we are supposed to say Shema Yisrael 3 times a day. One cannot claim that Israel and Zion, the land of the Jewish people, has nothing to do with what it means to be a Jew. So when people try to make that argument, their goal is to attack and malign the only Jewish state in the world. Real criticism of real Israeli policies is, of course, not anti-Semitic. And I'm sure everyone on this panel, and I'm sure all of you, criticize Israeli policy all the time. That's not a problem. It's not anti-Semitic. And frankly, no one is claiming that it is. So, for example, when Ilhan Omar makes the comments that she makes about AIPAC, and dual loyalty, and then says, I'm just criticizing Israeli policy, I ask everyone around her and all of the Congress people who came to make a statement, what Israeli policy she was talking about? Because I couldn't find one in any of the statements. I couldn't find any reference to settlement policy. I couldn't find any reference to checkpoints or even to the Palestinians at all. So the problem is the shield that anti-Zionism is actually criticism of a foreign government, and that's really what JVP is doing. And when Sarah said they're consenting to their own tokenization, I wrote that down in my head, and I'm going to quote her for a long time on that. When there are Jews who are bashing the Jewish community, calling them Zionists and saying that they support the ostensible politics and policies of Israel. And I say ostensible because none of these people actually understand the politics and policies of Israel. They are consenting to their own tokenization by saying we're the Jews who are the anti-Zionist Jews, and you can use us as the Jews to explain how bad the Jewish state is. There is a definition of anti-Semitism that was originally coined by Natan Sharansky. It's the 3 Ds. Is everyone familiar with the 3 Ds? No? Okay. Natan Sharansky is the former chairman of the Jewish Agency for Israel. He's a famous Soviet dissident. And the 3 Ds, the sort of, I don't know what the word, but the way that he defined anti-Semitism in today's day and age, the contemporary manifestation of anti-Semitism as anti-Zionism, is to say that when Israel is demonized, delegitimized, or held to a double standard that no other state is held to, that's anti-Semitism. So if you want to criticize Israeli policy and you want to talk about settlement construction, but you want to do that by saying the Jewish state is illegitimate, the Jews are oppressing the Palestinians, they are, it's an apartheid state, they're committing genocide against the Palestinians, and we see this through settlement policy. Or if you're talking about ostensible policies of Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians, but not talking at all about Syrian policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians or Jordanian policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians, if you don't care about any Palestinians except the ones who are under the control of Israel, then that's a double standard that you're applying to Israel to no other government in the world. So it's important that when people go to, supporting their anti-Zionist position and saying, really, we're just criticizing the Israeli government, that we respond by asking them what particular policy of the Israeli government they're actually referencing, because I will bet you that they don't have one. And Zioness does not take any positions whatsoever on the politics and policies of the Israeli government. And I mentioned earlier, it's because there are these litmus tests that are placed on Jews in all of these progressive spaces, and we are showing up as Zionists. We're not a pro-Israel advocacy organization. We're talking about Zionism as the liberation movement of the Jewish people. When you say that the Jewish people should not be liberated, should not self-determine in a sovereign state, but you think everyone else in the world should have a state, then that's anti-Semitism. That's not anti-Zionism. You're attacking the Jews for their civil rights movement, for trying to advance their community's human and civil rights. So I lost my train of thought. I could go on and on about this. But I would say that making sure that you're asking people so I was going to say, Zionist doesn't take positions on these things, but I still get the question all the time, what's the Zionist position on settlement policy? I get it more than any other question. And so first I say we don't talk about that. We're a Zionist organization. We are a progressive organization. We're providing a space where Zionists who are progressives can participate in the social justice movements that we care about here at home. But inevitably the question keeps coming, but what about settlements? But what about settlements? So I respond with a simple question. Are you talking about Amona or Modi'in Elite? Raise your hand if you know the difference. This is more than any room I've ever been in. I swear. And I've been with the leadership of the Jewish community, and it's like 150 people, and I'll get one hand. So it's not even worth defining the difference, but the point that I'm trying to make is that people love to say that their anti-Zionism is criticism of the policies of the Israeli government, but then they don't understand anything about the policies of the Israeli government. So that is a major problem. If you are picking Israel out of all of the nations in the world, the 200 or something nations in the world, and you're demonizing or delegitimizing Israel or holding Israel to a double standard that you don't hold anyone else to, that's not anti-Zionism. That is anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Amanda. Back to Janet. It has been asserted that on many U.S. university campuses and in some professional academic associations, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is being used to marginalize Jewish students and Jewish faculty from full participation in academic life, forcing them to deny their support for Israel or even hide the fact that they are Jewish. Do you think the BDS movement contributes to the mainstreaming of anti-Semitism? Please briefly define the BDS movement and discuss whether you believe this is a serious problem.
Thank you. Is there anyone who needs a explication of what BDS means? Most people do understand what that is. Presumably a non-violent movement, but my own experience with BDS came when I, almost alone, spoke out publicly against a BDS resolution promulgated by the National Women's Studies Association in 2015, and I can say this, that JVP, the Jewish Voice for Peace, was probably the greatest stimulus for the It is ostensibly, let me use that word again, nonviolent, but even in the materials that were circulated to members of the organization, the resolution said that BDS would really be the way to pressure the legitimate right to violence that the Palestinians have because of the oppression they're experiencing at the hands of Israel. I will say this about the BDS campaigns. They are not about changing the policies of the Israeli government. They are really more about ending the existence of the Israeli state. So, of course, there's no doubt that BDS marginalizes Jewish students and makes them feel silenced, or even pushes them to join anti-Israel campaigns as part of their social justice activism. I want to make the point that faculty, too, have joined these campaigns in large numbers. And I'll give you an example from my own family. Just before my grandson entered his first year at Connecticut College, a Jewish professor was pilloried for a year-old post on Facebook. Do not post on Facebook. He criticized Hamas in that post. All but a handful of his faculty colleagues joined with students who branded him as an Islamophobe. The professor, who up to that point had a long and very satisfying career at the university, ended up taking an extended leave rather than endure the almost unanimous and excruciating condemnation of his colleagues. My grandson, during his first year, had an eviction notice put under his door intended to replicate the Israeli expulsion of Arabs. This wasn't a good way for someone who identified with progressive issues to start college. I do want to say, agreeing with you, agreeing with all of this, that we do not have to yield to this. My grandson almost fell into joining Hillel when somebody asked him to go to a Tashlich ceremony. He had no intention of becoming very active, but he found his group by being dragged along to a Tashlich ceremony at the beginning of his first year. He ended up being active in Hillel and was the outreach coordinator and found ways to build coalitions with many, many other campus groups. Do I think, however, just as I mentioned earlier, that BDS campaigns will end, if they are ended, that anti-Zionism on campus will end? No. If that anti-Israel organizing tool isn't affected, another will be found to highlight Israeli so-called apartheid practices. So, what can I say further to denounce the BDS resolutions? I can say that we should still be very, very active and fight them, but my own way of addressing them is not to cite instance after instance of bad experiences that Jewish students in particular have suffered, and some faculty too, but to really argue that it is a violation of academic freedom. And I think we Jews have to support strenuously First Amendment rights and free speech wherever we see it being challenged. I'll give you one example that many of you have probably read about. Very, very recently, a professor at the University of Michigan had agreed to write a letter of recommendation for a student. When the professor realized that the student was planning to study in Israel, the professor declined to write the recommendation. The faculty member was disciplined for violating the academic freedom of the student. I think because BDS is so toxic, some are hoping that if we have anti-boycott pledges passed by various state legislatures, and they have been in a number of states, we will be doing something that will help students. I disagree with that. I really concur with Deborah Lipstadt. In her latest book, Antisemitism Here and Now, she notes that Jews have thrived in societies where democratic institutions and freedom of expression are salient, and have suffered miserably in both left-wing and right-wing societies where speech is suppressed, notably the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. Lipstadt believes, I agree, that Jewish students and all Jews will be more vulnerable if we call for the suppression of odious speech rather than answering it. And we can and must answer it. I also want to commend Lipstadt, and I like her suggestion that we replace "oi" with "joy." There are so many reasons to proudly celebrate our Jewish heritage. I remained, people may be shocked to hear it, in the National Women's Studies Association after they passed the resolution. I decided to step back, to consider my options, and I realized several things. The resolution passed by an overwhelming majority, but just as Quentin has mentioned, only a third of the membership voted. And I also realized by observing and having conversations that most who supported BDS were following the advocacy of Angela Davis, a frequent and much revered speaker, and other academic celebrities who were brought in to advocate for the resolution. Well, I'm happy to report that after a period where BDS was almost the only thing that was talked about by Jewish members of the association, we now have new and effective leadership, and we have panels and sessions that do not equate Jews with positions on Israel and Palestine only. And last year's conference featured a number of presentations on varied expressions of Jewish identity and culture. In my own work as an activist, I follow the model of Loretta Ross, who founded and worked for many years for an organization on reproductive justice for women of color. She defines activism as the art of making your life matter, and part of her work is to call in a calling out culture. She points out that attacking ideas and people with whom we disagree often brings us to a place where we resemble what we are struggling against. Calling in is not about silencing ourselves and others, but finding ways to disagree without victimizing, to have hard conversations and build relationships and community. I think that's what we are doing here tonight, and I am really grateful to be included. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Back to Quentin. We've talked at length about woke washing. What about pinkwashing? What is pinkwashing? Is the legitimacy of this accusation against Israel increasing in the progressive community? And what is its impact on LGBTQ Jews and their interest in and support for a Jewish state?
Thank you. Lots of washing going on. So to start with pinkwashing, we first need to understand that there's more than one definition of this word. There's the pinkwashing definition that Israelis will use that say it's not appropriate for Prime Minister Netanyahu, for example, to come to the AIPAC policy conference and talk about Israel's record on LGBT rights, but then fly home and vote against a bill in the Knesset that actually would have benefited the community. In my opinion, that is a totally legitimate criticism that Israelis are allowed to have of their own government. We're trying not to be political, but I wouldn't be happy if President Trump went around the world right now and said, look at our gay pride parades and our marriage equality, while he's actively trying to block my trans brothers and sisters who are patriotic Americans from serving in our armed forces. Those are legitimate criticisms. And what makes them authentic is they're done by the people that live in those nations. Big difference. Another difference of another definition of pinkwashing would be, well, Israel's record on LGBT rights is only promoted to distract people from XYZ, the occupation, the settlements, the treatment of the Palestinians, fill in whatever slander you'd like to use on Israel there. And I don't believe that that's a valid thing. There is no other LGBTQ community in the world that is held to that standard. Amanda touched on this a little bit. You wouldn't hold Russia's LGBTQ community responsible for the horrific policies of Putin or what's happening in Chechnya, where LGBT folks are literally being rounded up and put into concentration-like camps and likely being exterminated. Why should we hold the Chechen LGBT community or the Russian LGBT community responsible for those actions? That is a ludicrous double standard. And aside from it just being like something that most common sense people couldn't wrap their head around, it's also completely disingenuous. I said in my early remarks, Israelis fought long and hard, and people lost their lives to reach the level of equality that LGBTQ Israelis have today. When you are dismissing that entire record and all the hard work that it took just to say, oh, well, this is just a distraction from what's happening in the West Bank, is completely disingenuous. I've been an activist in this movement for 10 years of LGBTQ rights. I don't want my entire record and everything I fought hard for to just be erased because our current administration has some not so friendly policies to the LGBTQ community. That is a ridiculous double standard. But I know another great organization called White Bridge that has an excellent response to pinkwashing. We decided that what's different about our organization is that we are authentic within the LGBTQ community. We're not doing outreach to the community. We're not engaging the community. We are the community. And we wanted to make sure that people understood that. I mentioned that Israel has a long ways to go on LGBT rights, and that's true. However, there are 15 different amazing LGBT organizations in Israel that are working every day to continue to advance LGBT rights there. It's this thing a lot of people don't know. A lot of people in the LGBTQ community that knew, oh, there's an organization fighting for LGBT Arab refugees, many of them Palestinians who are at risk in their own local communities, who are getting aid and shelter and resources from an Israeli LGBTQ organization, or that there's a trans group that's working with trans sex workers trying to get them off the streets and into better opportunities for themselves. So last year, Wider Bridge made a bold decision to put our money where our mouth is. Let's not just walk the walk and talk the talk. We decided to invest dollars in 8 different LGBT organizations in Israel that are doing this work. Creates a whole new conversation when you go to someone and they say, well, you're pinkwashing. Really? I can give you 8 different projects I funded last year. What did you do to support LGBTQ Palestinians or Israelis? Oh, you got on your soapbox and turned up your megaphone again? Good for you. At the end of the day, it doesn't make a difference to the people that are living in this region that desperately need our support and our help. So those are 2 different definitions to pinkwashing that we always have to keep in mind and listen to who the audience is. Is it an Israeli talking about pinkwashing? And is it directed towards their government that are voting down their rights? Or is it coming from an already known critic to Israel on a number of different issues? I also think that LGBTQ community, I mentioned this, the LGBTQ community is inherently an intersectional community. We are everywhere. LGBTQ people exist in every ethnic group, every religion, every class, every gender identity. We are literally everywhere. It makes us a unique community. But with that diversity comes its own challenges. A lot of people, especially if you are a young queer person of color who grew up in a low-income neighborhood, and you hear about these poor people across the ocean called the Palestinians, and that they're facing similar issues as you, and you don't really know anything about this conflict or the region or the context behind it, of course you're going to want to support those people. The LGBTQ community prides itself on not only fighting for the equality of ourselves, but for all marginalized communities. That's why I'm a Zionist. That's why I'm a feminist. That's why I care about racial justice. These things affect me not just because as a queer person, but because I know people that are fighting these struggles, people I care deeply about. So I think that creates challenges. So you are seeing a lot of uptick in support for BDS among the LGBTQ community because there's lack of understanding about what BDS is, what are the intentions behind it, and who's benefiting from it. Go talk to a Palestinian who lost their job at the SodaStream factory in the West Bank, making 3 times the wages that their own Palestinian companies could give them, and they'll tell you exactly what they think about the BDS movement. Let's elevate those voices in our community. And the last thing I want to touch on, I mentioned that the marriage equality movement and the LGBTQ community has a lot to teach us as a pro-Israel community about how we face these challenges. When I'm meeting with a young, critical LGBTQ activist on a college campus, for example, who asked me, how dare could I support Israel? What about the occupation, settlements, XYZ? How could I do that? I asked them, what do you want to see in the future? Do you believe in a 2-state solution? Do you believe in 2 people living side by side in peace and security? And you start to talk to them, and you open them up, and you realize that you have common goals, but you maybe have different approaches of how we get there. I personally, as a progressive, do want to see a more progressive government in Israel. I want to see Israel become a state that has full LGBTQ rights for their citizens. But I know that if I want to see these outcomes, I have to put in the work. And there are plenty of organizations in Israel every day that are doing this work. And what makes us unique, let's actually back up for a second. Let's have a little test about how we feel about our country. How many people would say that America is divided right now? How many of you unfollowed someone on Facebook after the 2016 election because you just couldn't read another political post? How about a fight at a Seder table from someone who voted for the other party? All right. So us as Americans, I think, post-2016 election, regardless of how you feel about the outcome, can now understand what Israeli society has been like for the last 20 years. People are divided. They're in their silos. They don't want to talk to each other. But the LGBTQ community penetrates every single one of those silos. You will literally have LGBTQ Palestinians that live in East Jerusalem that will come and sit at the same table of an ultra-Orthodox LGBTQ Jew living in West Jerusalem. Not a joke. You will find LGBTQ settlers. You will find LGBTQ Jews in Tel Aviv that say that they're post-Zionist. But all of these people, despite their deep disagreements on a number of issues in Israeli society and to the conflict, are coming together to sit at the same table and to advance a common cause together, to work on LGBTQ rights together. That is a vehicle of change. And if you want to see a more progressive, more pluralistic, whatever Israel, you have to invest in the communities that are doing that work. And the LGBTQ community is the perfect model because we're doing it every day. We're forced to. There's not enough of us to say, well, I'm only going to work with people that agree with me in my community. We don't get that luxury. That's a privilege that we don't have. So what I would say to these activists is, look, I understand your concerns about how you feel about the current state of affairs in Israel. But I have an excellent organization that I can connect you to that holds the same values and the same missions that you're trying to accomplish. And together, let's look at the outcomes. Let's put in the work and we can get there. So I think that there's a lot to learn from this movement, and I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Quentin. Back to Sarah. You decided not to participate in the National Women's March in January because, as you wrote, the Women's March had an unspoken ideological litmus test of who gets in and who need not leave their identities and ideological orientations at the door. Can you explain to us why and how the U.S. progressive movement is making it so difficult for Sephardic and Mizrahi women to participate, and why you think it is important for Middle Eastern Jewish women to be in that space?
So I really commend you, Amanda, for participating, and I commend any Jewish woman who felt the need to show up and participate. I personally could not do it, and I grappled with it until the very last minute. I really wanted to. I have a major, like all of us, a major problem with the national leadership of the Women's March. How can you be a credible leader of a national movement of progress but still have to unlearn anti-Semitism? In my opinion, if you're holding any kind of bigotry that needs to be unlearned, then you simply are not qualified to lead a national movement of progress. How can you claim to be a credible intersectional advocate for universal women's rights, but then call for a boycott of half the Jewish women in the world? I could not get behind any banner that had the Women's March on it. I just did not feel comfortable doing that. this has nothing to do with being a Sephardic Jew or an Ashkenazi Jew. As a Jewish person, I absolutely could not bring myself to participate in this march. I felt the spirit of my great-grandmothers who had two totally different lives and experiences, telling me, do not get behind any leader, do not participate in any movement that is so deeply embroiled in anti-Semitic controversies. So now just to go back, to this question about Sephardic women and the Sephardic experience in progressive spaces, it goes back to this word of intersectionality. Intersectionality can be quite a complex theory to understand. I've been reading about it for a long time, and I still am struggling to deeply understand and integrate it into my activism. But I think that the simplest explanation is that intersectionality invites all of us to show up in any space in all of our entirety. We all hold diverse identities. We're Jewish, we're Sephardic, we're Middle Eastern, we're immigrants, we're gay, we're queer, we're mothers, we're brown-skinned, we hold all of these diverse identities within us. And when we show up to an intersectional space, if it's truly intersectional, every element of who we are is welcomed. The litmus test that Amanda was talking about was the primary reason why I could not go to the Women's March. I was not willing to leave my Zionist identity at the door to feel welcomed in this space. I hold other identities, one of them being a mixed Sephardic Ashkenazi Jew. I'm the granddaughter of a Holocaust survivor. I'm a mom raising a family that's even more diverse than I am. I was not willing to partake in the litmus test. I was not willing to leave my Zionism at the door because of my Sephardic identity, because I'm a dual citizen of Israel, because I understand the struggles that Sephardic and Mizrahi women are facing in Israel. I spoke out in that article. Unfortunately, in Israel, the women who are deeply affected by the rockets from Hamas and by the violence are disproportionately Sephardic and Mizrahi women. As I said earlier, Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews are over half of Israel's Jewish population. And the Sephardic and Mizrahi women are facing a disproportionately high rate of anti-Semitic violence that's coming from Gaza and from other, acts of violence in Israel. Here in the United States, there's a long history of Sephardic and Mizrahi women being asked to leave their Middle Eastern identities at the door to participate in feminist spaces and other progressive spaces. This isn't a new issue. This has been going on for a very long time. And I think a lot of it goes back to the fact that we live in an Ashkenormative American community. It wasn't my great-grandmother was told that she must not be Jewish if she spoke Ladino. If you don't speak Yiddish, how can you be a Jew? And I think for younger generations, it's those issues aren't, the issues aren't the same, but it's more deeply related to Zionism and the strong connection to Israel. So I hope that answers the question. I did write an article about it. It's in Times of Israel. You can Google me and read it if you'd like to learn more. But I am not willing to leave my Zionism at the door. I'm not willing to leave my family history at the door. And I will never participate in a movement that's being led by anti-Semites.
Thank you, Sarah. This comes to our last round of questions before we get to the audience Q&A. And first question for everyone, we can go in the same order, I guess, starting with Amanda. Can each of you just take a couple of moments and tell us what you think is the one thing that each of you would recommend in order to combat the growing anti-Semitism in the progressive movement?
Okay, so my answer is a little bit of a challenge to Sarah's position, and I do it with love. Zionists exist to combat the narrative that is in the space where you can't show up as a progressive and a Zionist. When we are showing up under the Zionist banner, we are not checking our identities at the door, and we are refusing to cede the spaces to bigots. If we are not there, the only narrative that controls is the bigoted one, is the anti-Semitic one. And that narrative is being adopted by people who don't know anything, and they hear what's being presented to them. It's like, the BDS resolutions being adopted in academic associations because they're only hearing from Angela Davis. We need to be in the spaces if we want to challenge the narratives that exist there. We also want to be in the spaces because our community is overwhelmingly committed to civil rights and social justice. So when we're forced to stay home, especially young American Jews, we are losing them as members of our community because they don't know where they belong, where they fit in, and where they can go and stand proudly. So in my opinion, the way to combat the problem is to show up in the space as a Zionist. That is why we exist. Staying home is not going to solve the problem. Our community is too small. Nobody notices a boycott by 18 Jews in the Women's March in New York City that has 300,000 people in it. But they do notice when they see you there and you have your poster and you are standing proudly with all of your authentic selves. They notice that. They see you there. And I promise you, the anti-Semitic leadership of the DC Women's March sees us. I have been attacked by them on multiple occasions. They see us. We are changing the narratives that they have worked for all of this time to perpetuate. We are challenging them and fighting back, and they are afraid that we will win. That means we show up in full force and we double down. We do not cede the spaces to bigots, and we have to protect the integrity of the movements. I didn't actually answer the very first question, which is really about the Women's March, but we are seeing what's happening. We saw what happened with the Women's March this year. It was the third annual march, and it was just a sea of controversy on anti-Semitism. We saw what happened with the British Labour Party. We're watching the British Jews not only leaving the party, but threatening in mass to leave the UK completely. When the Jewish community doesn't have a voice and we don't have representation, we're in big trouble. And that means that we have to fight back and stand up and say, this is our home. The political left is our home, whether you agree or whether it's your personal home aside. 80% of American Jews believe that the political left is our home. If we're pushed out of it and we don't have anywhere else to go, we're voiceless. We are powerless. It's not a reality that we can ever accept. And that means that we have to push the anti-Semitism out of the space, which means we have to be in the space to do that. And that's how we protect the movements. The Women's March, if we had been there, we were there. What happened this third year where people finally started paying attention was after years of work from Zioness and a lot of other groups. But if we had been doing this before the Women's March launched, if we had, as a community, pushed the anti-Semitism out of the spaces and explained to people what was really happening, everything would be completely different. But we weren't, and we're far behind. And that's why it's hard when we show up and we do feel attacked. But it's not too late. It simply isn't. And the women's movement, the American feminist movement, is so closely tied now to the Women's March and now is so embroiled in this anti-Semitism controversy that women in America are suffering. And that is how we can come together and build relationships and find allies in women in America who want to see the Women's March succeed and who understand, whether they're Zionist or post-Zionist or anti-Zionist, whether they have absolutely no idea what Zionism is, which is most people, they know that the anti-Semitism is destroying the movements. So when we show up, we build relationships, we empower other people to stand with us, we refuse to check our Zionism at the door, we talk about it as a progressive movement, we talk about it as inherent to the Jewish identity, and we push the anti-Semitism out of the space. It's the only choice. There's no other option. So please join us.
I feel like there are multiple choices, and I am a stayer. Pardon? Oh, I'm sorry.
Pass that one too.
Yeah.
Here, you can use this one.
Okay, it's good now. I feel that I don't want to have anybody speak for me. I do feel deeply respectful of the decision not to participate. Myself, I feel I will stay, and I will stay, and I will stay as long as I can see that there is some hope for building alliances. So I am more inclined to enter the fray because I have had some successful experiences as you have. I also feel that instead of only focusing on the Women's March, the massive demonstrating, I'm going to take a page from your book, Quentin. I think that the last 2 years, after the big march after Trump's election, which was a unifying event and a thrilling and exciting event where people felt we were really coming together in unity, and then things fell apart for the reasons you cite. I have gone the last 2 years to the New Bedford, Massachusetts Women's March, where 300 people show up, where a whole day is devoted to talking amongst ourselves about how we can build a community based on values, on human dignity, on mutual respect. And in that setting, I am never uncomfortable raising issues of anti-Semitism. So I think that we can work from the grassroots. I think we can work from the top, wherever we are, as long as we are doing the work. We have to embrace our Jewish culture with enthusiasm, joy, passion, and that's what I think we're going to all do together at this table, the speakers, and I feel the vibes from the audience as well.
So just like our acronyms, I like to have multiple tools to use. I think the first is something that Amanda touched on that I want to dive a little bit more into, which is allyship. We're really good at this within our own community. Each of us, a Wider Bridge and Zioness are working together as frequently as we can. We often partner with other communities within the broader Jewish community to partner, to support one another. We're really great allies to our fellow Jews. But I think we need to take a long look in the mirror and see if we're still good allies to some of the other marginalized communities in this country. We used to be. How many people in this room marched for civil rights in the 60s? How many people fought for racial justice then? We used to be really good at it. It was a staple of American Jewish activism. And I don't know where that went. And I think that we really need to take a long look at ourselves and realize that if we want other people to care about rising anti-Semitism, if we want people to push back on the BDS movement and to stand with us against anti-Zionism, we need to be good allies for them too. Relationships aren't a one-way street. I can't go to an activist that cares about Black Lives Matter and say, hey, come stand with me about the rockets falling on southern Israel right now. But when their community members are being gunned down in our streets, I'm not going to be there for them. We have to understand that. A fundamental part of community building and coalition building is being a good ally. Secondly, I'm going to keep going back to the marriage equality movement because I'm feeling real proud today about this. I came out in 2009. I was 14 years old in a tiny town in Iowa, 3,000 people, very evangelical Christian. I was the only openly gay kid in the entire town. And I was so jazzed up about marriage equality after this movement, I decided to get involved. And I went to the state's LGBT rights organization. I said, look, I'm fired up. I'm ready to go. Put me to work. And they had me doing door knocking. Who's volunteered for a political campaign and had to do door knocking? Not the most fun thing to do. You never know what you're going to get on the other side of that door. And I, this small, bright-eyed, little bushy-tailed gay boy, would run up to the doors, knock on it, and say, how do you feel about gay marriage? I had a lot of interesting conversations. But what I realized from that conversation is the importance of having those conversations to begin with. We might not have always started from the same point, but I tell you, by the end of those conversations, we ended up at least in a place of mutual respect for where each person was coming from. And what I started to realize, and many of us in the LGBT rights movement started to realize, is that it didn't matter how many 2,300 plus rights I wasn't getting federally in marriage by being denied. Those weren't the things that people cared about. It wasn't the statistics. It wasn't, the rise of numbers of hate crimes, for example, that really moved people to get behind marriage equality and broader LGBT rights. It was people's personal stories. When people started to realize that, oh, you're talking about my nephew, my cousin.
Give us just a moment. We're going to figure out how to get the lights turned back on. Quentin, if you're all right, you can keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what we learned from that experience was that you had to put a face to the issues. I'm going to wait a second. I feel like everyone's distracted.
This is not time for Havdalah. We're just going to figure out how to get the lights back on. Just a moment. Sorry, Quentin.
All right. Okay, so what we learned from that experience was if you put in the effort to humanize these issues and you make it about your own personal story rather than some potentially divisive and controversial political issue, you can actually make a difference. I think what I've learned from that is now I'm having to go and do the same with Israelis in Israel. People have this preconceived notion about what Israel is or what Israelis are, that they're, there's something to be feared, that they're, big idea, thank you. Let there be light.
Sorry about that, Quentin.
So I've got to get my train of thought again. I apologize. So I think we need to reframe this. We need to reframe the way that we talk about Zionism. We need to reframe why we care about Israel. And why other people, even those that aren't in the Jewish community, should also care about Israel. We have to reframe these conversations into language that people can understand and can relate to. I think the last thing I kind of want to close with is I have a Hebrew tattoo on my forearm in a similar location to where the serial numbers were put during the Holocaust. And it's a Hebrew word that says chitnatut. My Israeli boyfriend will correct me on my Hebrew later. But the word means resistance. I know everyone post-2016 likes to say that they're the resistance, but some of us were actually doing this work long before Donald Trump came into office. And I think that you have to continue to be resilient. You can't cede ground. You can't stop showing up in spaces, and you can't not have a stake in this game. If we stop defending ourselves and standing up for ourselves, who will do it for us? And the most important lesson that Jews should always remember, and that Israel has solidified for us, that our right of self-determination, our safety, our security, our future is now in our hands, and we have a responsibility to do something with it.
Okay, so I'm constantly torn between the tension of self-preservation versus activism, because on the one hand, I am an activist, but on the other hand, my DNA, my history, all of our histories, tells me that anti-Semitism is a beast that Jews have never really been able to control, unfortunately. I wish I was optimistic. I wish I felt that we could enter into these progressive spaces and turn the tide, and perhaps we will. America's very different than Eastern Europe was, or Spain, or many other places in the world where we've dealt with anti-Semitism. I don't feel a great sense of optimism right now. I really wish I did. That doesn't mean I'm going to give up on my activism. To the contrary, I feel that I want to fight harder right now. I'm still deciding what that looks like. I think, though, that self-preservation means something very different now. We have Israel. We have a Jewish state. This isn't, Germany in the 1930s. We have a homeland. We have an IDF. We have a place that is ours, that it may not be the safest place. There's many issues, but it is a sovereign Jewish nation. So I think that between this tension, between this desire for self-preservation and this desire to go out and fight, the answer for me has, I think, always lied in supporting Israel as best I can by donating money, by getting involved in a cause here in the United States that supports Israel. I think we can also support Jewish organizations here that are working to advocate for Israel. We're all, involved heavily in causes that are trying to educate the masses on what Israel is and what Zionism is. So I think that that's like a very natural, safe answer for American Jews. But I hope that we can continue passing down an understanding of what Israel is to our children and our grandchildren by going there, by developing a personal relationship, by taking it out of the context of the news cycle and these hashtags and turning it into something real. I was telling my dad in the car, I'm always surprised by how disconnected American Jews, or the vast majority of American Jews, really are from Israel. We need to go there and know it. That is our safe space. So that's my...
Thank you very much to all the panelists for your answers to those questions. Now we're going to open up with the time we have left. Exactly like you're doing back there, please raise your hand if you have a question. We have people with microphones that will come around. The key thing here is that the question must be a question. It ends with a question mark. And please avoid speeches and try to remain with a question for our panelists, please. Sir?
Yes, I'm surprised that, and I'm wondering why I have not heard from this group that the Muslim Brotherhood is the funds behind BDS, and why we haven't been bringing that to the attention. Second of all, why we haven't heard how the Israeli doctors in northern Israel are taking care of Syrian wounded, no matter which side of the aisle they're on, and they've been taking care of them non-discriminatorily. And there was a third thing that I would have liked to have been heard, but I can't remember it.
Well, thank you for the comment, and anyone's welcome to answer that. I think the focus tonight is on these elements of the progressive movement, so a lot of what we've talked about tonight has been focused in that area, and I don't think any of us would deny those points, but please.
Well, oh yeah, okay, so after this one we'll collect a few. So I would just say the title of this panel is domestic progressive social justice issues. There are tons of other things out there that could be talked about in various panels, but not really this one.
Thank you, Amanda. We had a suggestion that we could collect a few questions and then we'll be able to answer them together. Does that work for everyone? Are we over here now? Please go ahead.
This question is for Janet. You quoted Deborah Lipstadt, and I seem to remember that she was very active, and she did institute a lawsuit against a Holocaust denier. Am I correct in that? Yes. Okay. And my second question is for Amanda. Amanda, how do you, you talked about being involved. Now, last week there was a conference, Duke, University of North Carolina, and those people who were anti-BDS were not even allowed to speak. It was very ugly. So I don't know how you get involved when you're not allowed to voice your opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Amanda, do you want to just take a moment to answer that now? It was a direct question.
Sure. So there are a lot of challenges, and we're fighting them every day. We're trying to figure out ways to be involved, even when we're pushed out of certain spaces. There was a similar conference at NYU last week with some of the same speakers that were at Duke and that have been in North Carolina and welcome there. And Zioness did a panel 2 nights later with half of our board, an incredible, diverse group of progressive leaders and feminists and Zionesses. And we filled a big auditorium at NYU addressing some of the issues that had been brought up 2 nights before by the BDS crowd. So you can always host another event at a university, and if there's an event where you're not allowed to speak, I think that's a huge problem. I think, the First Amendment would dictate otherwise, but as a lawyer, I know that there are differences in public schools and non-public schools and how the universities address these things. If there were groups that wanted to, Zioness was not contacted about that, and I gotta be honest, we're a tiny new organization with very limited resources, so we can't be everywhere at once. But if anyone had reached out to us about the Duke event and asked us how we would get involved, we would have suggested another event with Zioness speakers addressing all of the issues and inviting the people who were at that other event to come and hear from us as well.
Very good. Where do we have the microphone? Over here, please.
Hi, thank you for coming. I wanted to ask, Representative Omar, the freshman congresswoman from Minnesota, has been on record with many anti-Semitic statements and tweets and posts. Do you feel it would be important, she also happens to be on the Foreign Affairs Committee, do you feel it would be important to get her off that, and if so, how could that best be done? Thank you.
We'll take a few more. We'll note that one to come back to. Where's our microphone now? Over here.
Janet, you mentioned about freedom of speech, and unfortunately I feel that that's generational to our generation. And I'd like to hear from the others in terms of the progressive support of trigger words and safe spaces and how that affects the Jewish community, particularly as it relates to freedom of speech.
And why don't we take one more and we'll answer them, and then we'll come back if we have more time. How about that? Right here, Danny.
How do universities distinguish between academic freedom and anti-Semitism?
All right, very good. Thank you, Danny. Why don't we take some time to answer those few, and we'll see what time we have left. Janet, did you have a comment on the Deborah Lipstadt question?
Well, I guess I want to comment about the free speech issue. I don't think it's a generational, it can't be a generational divide. I think we have made a terrible mistake in terms of the older generation, myself included, to judge and belittle students who are feeling unsafe. I think it is much better to enter a conversation with them. Certainly when I was teaching, if a student said some of the material is going to remind me of something that is traumatizing, I would respect that and have a conversation with the student, excuse the student, find a way to frame the material in a way that's appropriate. I think we made a mistake of setting ourselves up, many of us, as these are sissies, these are babies. An academic institution is a place where people have to hear all ideas, and I think it was a very self-righteous response. However, if we give up the notion of every voice being heard, including the new representative from Minnesota, and isolating her, throwing her off her committee, I think we play into the hands of forces that are going to ultimately perpetuate anti-Semitism and say those Jews with their power, answer her when she makes a statement, do what you're asking that we do. Correct the statement. Use every platform we have to make corrections, to use our speech instead of trying to isolate and silence others. I think that our democracy is in peril. We really need to preserve the rights that we have, and speech rights are very key. Going back to Lipstadt, and then I'll let others speak, please. I talk a lot. Going back to Lipstadt, yes, she took that stand, and she challenged a person who denied the Holocaust. And worldwide, everyone heard, this is not going to happen. She used her opportunity to speak. So we all need to do that rather than attack somebody who is speaking ill of us.
Just a quick thing on Ilhan Omar, the Foreign Affairs Committee. A lot of people don't realize this, but she is not on the Middle East subcommittee, and she doesn't vote on the issues relating to Israel. She is on an Africa subcommittee, and that's because she's a Somali refugee. She was put there because for a lot of reasons she has the experience to be there, and because there are a lot of people who are inspired by her for a lot of good reasons. Obviously, being inspired by the anti-Semitism is bad. I don't think, I don't support that being an inspiration. But I actually heard from Congressman Steny Hoyer on this, who said, and it was really interesting, that Ted Deutsch, this is, inside baseball, but Ted Deutsch, who I know, you guys, I assume you're all fans of, is actually chairing the subcommittee that relates to Israel issues, and he actually does not have seniority to chair that subcommittee, but there's a reason that he's there while she is on the Foreign Affairs Committee. So this is all very complicated, but we have a friend on the subcommittee that is dealing with Israel and making sure that the Foreign Affairs Committee is deeply committed to Israel's safety and security. And I agree with Janet. We have to be really careful. It's not that I think, if you look up the Zionist statements on Ilhan Omar, I think you will see very clearly how strongly we came out to say this is not progressive, this is anti-Semitic, this is not about Israeli policy. American Jews are afraid. This cannot be pushed aside. It cannot be, it cannot be excused. It simply can't, and we all have an obligation to call it out, and we're very disappointed in the fact that it was impossible somehow for Congress to put out an explicit condemnation of anti-Semitism without lumping everything else in. But I will say also, there is a little bit of hypocrisy on all sides. Has everyone heard about, the all lives mattering of the Jewish community? Because there are a lot of people who refuse to say Black Lives Matter. A lot of people on the right who refuse to say Black Lives Matter because that means white lives don't. And I personally am very offended by that thinking. I think it should be totally fine and critically important, actually, for all progressives and people of conscience to say Black Lives Matter. And when people said, no, it's not about Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, there was a backlash to that on the left, obviously, but there were a lot of people who said, we have to say all lives matter, it can't be about a specific community. So if you were one of those people, and I have no idea, who all of you are in the audience, this is not an accusation, but for all of the people who wanted to say all lives matter, I can't bring myself to say Black Lives Matter, who are now condemning the fact that Congress basically said all lives matter, it's not just about anti-Semitism, we have a problem. There's hypocrisy everywhere. Congress should have put out a statement condemning anti-Semitism because the Jewish community faced an experience that was damaging and painful, traumatizing and dangerous. And in that moment, the Jewish community needed the support of Congress and elected leaders and faith leaders and everyone in America to stand very strongly our ground on this issue. But that goes for other communities too. And Quentin mentioned this, and I talk about this a lot. It's a two-way street. No one's going to be there for us if we're not there for them too. Black Lives Matter, anti-Semitism is bad, LGBTQ people should be treated equally. We all need to be there for all of these communities if we want people to be there for us.
I think let's go ahead and take some other questions, but I just want to touch on the safe space thing. Historical context is important. Safe spaces were created because not too long ago, the LGBT teen suicide rate was 4 times higher than their heterosexual peers. They were being told from their parents, from their faith leaders, from their classmates, that they were not equal, that they were an abomination, that they deserved to burn in the fires of hell. I've experienced this personally. You should have seen the outrage when I decided to be my authentic self in my local community. Those spaces are important, and I don't want them to become politicized and another buzzword that we throw out. LGBT teen suicide rate is still, it's not quite as 4 times as high, but it's still higher than their heterosexual peers. You look at transgender teens, it's about 8 times higher. We have work to do, and these spaces exist for that reason. More questions?
I have a question and a mic. Where are you? Hello. First of all, I am not at home. The political left is not my home, but I applaud. I'm thrilled to hear all of you. I applaud everything you're doing and your passion. My question is, the college students on the campuses today who are crammed in together in the progressive space and other spaces, do any of you have any formalized training program for those progressive students as to how they can speak out as a Zionist or as part of the LGBTQ movement to support Israel? Are you giving them the words, because we've just listened to 4 articulate, intelligent people here, are you training the students on the campuses to fight that battle with their language as well?
Can I answer the question, please? Because I have a very, go ahead, but I have an answer for his question.
Okay, we're trying to take questions for the moment. However, the speakers will hang around a few minutes, so we'll be able to do that, but Would you like to?
So I just want to answer that because JIMENA has a lot of experience working on college campuses. That's actually the foundation of our organization was built on a desire to outreach to college students. Going back to this word of intersectionality and also dealing with allyship, JIMENA has been outreached and works closely with a number of Yazidi groups and even Muslim groups and other communities, other minority communities from the Middle East and North Africa. In fact, we found that they have a stronger desire to partner with us and learn with us and collaborate with us than some of the Jewish organizations in our community. We've been called on numerous times by college groups in the Bay Area and San Francisco where we're based to liaison between Jewish students and BDS anti-Zionist groups. UC Berkeley came to us asking for us to facilitate dialogue between the group, the Muslim Student Association that was authoring the BDS group and the pro-Israel group on college campuses that was doing everything, Tikva Students for Israel, they were doing everything in their power to stop this. I think that every Jewish organization I know is working hard on college campuses. They're trying to empower students with language, with facts, with information, and with support to become strong advocates for Israel and to realize that there are organizations that are serving them. We do have an advocacy training that we give to students who want to incorporate the story of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa into their work on college campuses. So, and I know we're one of many groups that are doing that. And we're like a niche organization. You know, we're not like Stand With Us. We're not a big organization. We are giving talking points and information to groups like Stand With Us and to all these large organizations who want to tell the story that we're committed to sharing. So,
Anyone else for student?
I think let's go with another question.
I'm very proud to be here tonight as a board member of Stand With Us. Stand With Us is, I'm sure you're all aware of it, it's one of the preeminent organizations on college campuses training, and in high schools, training Jewish kids to be proactive for Israel. We are a total teaching organization, and we have the materials and the teaching instruction to train our children so they are prepared when they go to college. What happens with my question is, the BDS movement on college campuses is so vicious and so rampant right now. If I was sending my child to college today, I would declare that my college campus is creating a hostile environment for my child. And when you create a hostile environment, that is a legal term. And the college presidents, why are we not going after college presidents? Why have they stuck their head in the sand on this issue? And they are allowing this ugly hate speech to take over college campuses, and there is no balanced discourse anymore. It is strictly one-sided. So when you talk about free speech, the Jewish kids are being denied free speech. The Jewish issue is being denied its balanced discourse. And my question is, where is the responsibility of the college presidents on this issue? It's become an absolutely out-of-hand issue, the BDS movement on campuses.
Thank you. I think that goes well with Danny's question about how do you balance academic freedom and what becomes anti-Semitism.
So I think that what to do with the presidents is a little bit outside of tonight's topic, but I'll talk briefly about it. I'm a lawyer, and before launching Zioness, I worked at an organization called the Lawfare Project, which is a Jewish civil rights organization, litigation organization. And a week and a half ago, we settled a 3-year case against San Francisco State University for a pervasively hostile environment against Jewish students, and First Amendment violations, 14th Amendment violations, violations of the California Unruh Act, which is the state civil rights code. So there are ways to stand up for Jewish students on campus legally. When you say that you would declare a hostile environment, I would just urge you to be very careful, because it is a nearly impossible burden to meet in a court of law. And there are instances, I believe, that San Francisco State University is one of them. We actually settled. It's an incredible settlement. If anybody is interested, you can Google it. We are extremely, extremely proud. We worked with Winston & Strawn, which is a global law firm that put together a team of 20 pro bono attorneys, $4 million of pro bono legal services for this case. And we got the school to declare that Zionism is an important part of the Jewish identity for many students, for many Jewish students, which for this school, this insanely anti-Semitic school where it says F you blah blah Zionists all over campus, chalked all over the campus quad, hanging up on bulletin boards across the campus, that was a huge deal. But the hostile environment under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is truly a nearly impossible burden. There has not been a successful case for Jewish students. I'm sure that there are legal organizations that will continue fighting to win one of those cases, but what it's going to require, what it's required for other communities as well is it's such a high standard. Well, it's a different standard in sexual harassment cases. The hostile environment, whatever. I just don't want to get in too far in the wrong way, but there are ways to hold university presidents accountable, and now we have set a precedent that university presidents can be reminded of on a regular basis. There are not only legal nonprofits, the Lawfare Project is a tiny organization, but there are major international litigation firms that are willing to commit gigantic teams to supporting the Jewish community when a hostile environment could potentially be found or when there is a First Amendment violation. And I totally agree with you that the Jewish students are actually being silenced. So it does go to the First Amendment question and the academic freedom question. There is no line that's being drawn right now between academic freedom and anti-Semitism. People have no idea how to define or understand these problems or how to draw a bright line. It goes back to the conversations that we had at the beginning of this panel about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. People are not clear on this, and when there's this shield, this defense of, but we're talking about Israeli policy, we're criticizing Israel, or when there are organizations like JVP that Sarah talked a lot about, that are out there saying it's not anti-Semitism when you attack Jews. It's not anti-Semitism when you call Jews Zionists and refuse to allow them to participate in events on campus. It's not anti-Semitism when you say Zionists are not welcome here at San Francisco State, get the F off our campus. Or when a tenured professor who runs an entire academic department at the university posts on the social media of that department saying that the existence of Zionists on campus is a declaration of war against Arab, Muslim, and Palestinian students. This actually happened at San Francisco State, and people have a hard time calling it anti-Semitism because JVP says it's not. So we have to figure out within our community how to unify around the very obvious conclusion that is anti-Semitism, because when we allow JVP and some other radical fringe tiny groups to speak for us, it's impossible for people to hear us as the vast majority of American Jews and diaspora Jews trying to explain that, like every other marginalized community in the history of the world, we get to describe what bigotry against us looks and feels like. It's not up to anyone else to say, that's not anti-Semitism. It's up to us to say it, and we have to demand that. And that means we have to be out there in the spaces. I hate to say it again. We have to be there pushing back when someone else is claiming to speak for us. So we have work to do. And coming to this event is amazing, but get everyone you know to show up in these spaces and to push back and to do it in a positive and empowering way, I would say. We have to be really careful that we're not attacking people. I think, this is what Janet was trying to say about Ilhan Omar. We have to be careful, not because we're wrong in feeling targeted, but we have to think strategically about how to make sure that we're not attacking people and that there's no double standard against her that has not been applied against, for example, Kevin McCarthy. So we have to do this stuff really carefully. And that goes to this question about how to activate and empower students on campus with the right language. I do think Stand With Us is doing some great work. Zioness is very different from Stand With Us. We're not a pro-Israel organization. We are a progressive organization that is creating a space for Zionists to participate in domestic social justice movements. We are really new. I've been full-time at Zioness for 3 months, literally. So we're working through a strategic plan. We had our first board meeting last week. We talked a lot about content and training and how to work with college students to make sure that when they want to be active in the progressive movements that they care about, they have a home and a place and the right language and that they're equipped. So give us just another month, maybe.
We've got time for one more. We've got a gentleman back here.
Yeah, question for Amanda. On 2 occasions tonight, you've lightly touched on but passed over the settlement question. I think you said that it was not really relevant to your definition of Zionism. And if that's the case, that may be true, but it's extremely relevant to people that are anti-Zionism. So to just sort of dismiss it as not being worthy of discussion is a little bit troubling to me. And then you raised the question of, like, how many of you know the difference between the two villages that begin with an M, and nobody seemed to, so therefore it was evidence that you didn't really need to go any further. But that's not doing us much good. So I want to hear something from you on that issue.
Well, you're not going to hear anything from me in my capacity as the executive director of Zioness. I'm happy to talk to you about my personal opinion on settlement policy outside the room, but I want to explain, because it's a totally fair question, and I want to explain why Zioness takes the position that we do. The imposition of the question, when we're active in the space and the question is, but what Jew? Hey, Jew over there, what do you think about settlement policy? That is a litmus test that no one else is subjected to. And when you respond by saying, do you ask anyone else? Do you ask a Moroccan at the Women's March what they think about Morocco's occupation of Western Sahara? It's not that I'm passing over or ignoring settlement policy. I have a lot of personal opinions on settlement policy. The point, what Zioness is doing is rejecting litmus tests that are placed on Jews that are not placed on anyone else. And I think it's really important that we refuse to answer the question not because we can't engage or don't want to engage. And this goes to the actual policy question. When people ask about specific Israeli policies, if they want to talk about how the Israeli Supreme Court said that Amona is an illegal settlement and Israeli soldiers had to go and watch it be deconstructed. What's the word I'm looking for? Dismantled, yes. Amona was dismantled, just like, when the Israeli military went into Gaza and pulled every last Jew out of Gaza, and the Israeli military was attacked by Jews in Gaza for pulling them out. This is a policy conversation that people in the Zionist community have all the time, and activists in our communities can go out into the world, and if they're asked about settlement policy and they're speaking to someone who actually knows something and actually wants to talk about policy, real, not imagined, not ostensible, real policy, that's a beautiful thing. That just doesn't happen. So, or I haven't seen it. Maybe there's one or two people that are having real substantive conversations about actual existing policies. But the reason why Zioness doesn't engage is because we are a domestic social justice organization and we want to advance domestic movements. And in my opinion, there is no place for a conversation on settlement policy in the Women's March or in the Pride Parade or the March for Racial Justice or the Families Belong Together March. It simply should not exist there, again, because nobody else is subjected to these things and because it only serves to divide and destroy our movements. So when we show up and we say, we don't want to talk about settlement policy here, we're happy to have a conversation with you outside of this space at an appropriate time about real policy. That's great. No problem with that whatsoever. Again, I'm not glossing over it. The whole point is to reject the litmus test, and that's where that settlement conversation comes up.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. That's all the time we have here tonight. Thank you to Sarah, Quentin, Janet, and Amanda, and thank you for being here, and please keep an ear out for future programming from JCRC and from the Federation. Have a great night. And thank you. Check.